So we wanted to talk today about performance management and some of the things that, see, I did screw this up. The agenda for today is really to talk about its purpose, talk a little bit about ownership. We won't spend a lot of time on that, and what does the future of it look like. There's been some changes, almost, we've changed a little bit, and I think we've sort of gone back to not necessarily where we started, but we'll talk a little bit about that. Some important aspects of performance management, and we'll talk about the cycle. And then finally, I think it's always useful to do an exercise. So do something practical to see what it looks like, what it feels like, to see if it's something that, whether you've already adopted it in your place of work or something that you would like to adopt going forward. So basically that's the agenda. We'll spend probably between 30 and 40 minutes going through the slide deck. It's not hopefully death by PowerPoint, but to give you an idea and have some discussion through that process, and then do an exercise for about 30 to 35 minutes. And we have a small group, so that's good. We can be a little bit more intimate in that respect. So performance management. A couple of questions here. First one being, what's the purpose of performance management? Anybody would like to give us their thoughts in terms of why we do it? What value does it bring to the organization? Yeah, two really good. So development of people, realizing their potential, and I'll repeat this for the camera. And I think your point was it's really a good idea to use this to clearly lay out what you expect of people. Okay. Well, hopefully we can give you some. I can give you some tips, and so can Bev when she talks about succession planning, because you'll see how we'll try to bring those links and make those links for you. But in terms of, we want to talk about who owns it as well, and what's the future of performance management. So I think in terms of purpose, I think we've covered some of this ground already, and that's why we asked the question, so that I don't really need the slide, but promote and improve employee effectiveness and potential, and develop people, right? As you said, it's important to use this as a process to clearly lay out expectations. It's a continuous process, so we'll talk about that cycle, and that's to plan for the performance cycle, to monitor it, and to review. It's a collaborative process, so it's between the manager and the employee, or the supervisor and the employee. So we certainly sometimes certain things get dictated in terms of compensation, or I should say in terms of competencies. But at the end of the day, it should be in a collaborative process whereby you set your expectations, but you try to do that in a collaborative process. And we talked about links before. It needs to be linked to other processes. So there's a bunch of processes we've listed here that are I think important pieces of this whole discussion on performance management. In terms of recruitment, can anybody think of how you would link those two things, performance management and recruitment? Any thoughts on that? So when you recruit people, you would use, let's say you were looking at specific competencies, you would maybe design questions around those competencies, right? As an example. So if you're looking for somebody who's got strong leadership or strong problem-solving skills, you would like to know, using the behavioral model of interviewing, can you give us an example of a problem that you solved in the workplace, et cetera, those kinds of things. Orientation, again, I think the same point here is, we need to have some sort of process that clearly lays out our expectations in terms of what we expect from people. Probationary reviews are very important. I mean, it really gives us an opportunity to look at, what the organization expects from the individual and what the individual expects from the organization, and make sure that it's a good fit. Hopefully through the recruitment process you've made good selections, but that's not always the case. And sometimes also from the employee standpoint, they realize that maybe this organization isn't the right organization for them. So probationary reviews are very important, and I've seen many cases where, perhaps it hasn't been done effectively, and then it creates a lot of problems down the road. So it's important to do that well. Succession planning, again, it's a direct link, I think, to performance management, and at the end of the day, it's really about, through the performance management process, we're going to identify how people are performing. Through that process, we're going to identify people that perform, reasonably well in their job, some people that have gaps, and then we'll identify those gaps, but we're also going to hopefully identify people that are doing really well in their role, and those people start to get identified as those people that can go to the next level of the organization. So performance management is, I believe, the foundation of a good succession planning process, which is why Bev and I sort of linked up on this, and you'll see in our exercise that our exercise has it's the same case. We start out doing an exercise on a performance review process that leads into succession planning. Okay. Compensation, well, again, it's linked to compensation because, often we're going to give people increases in that based on how they're performing, right? If they're not performing up to expectations, then we may hold those increases, right? And then finally, the cultural and values of the organization. Obviously, if we're saying we're a people, as in our organization of people that, an organization that's defined by its people, we should have a performance review process that clearly, embraces that. Right? Okay. Any thoughts or comments before I move on? Questions? So the ownership piece, it's really owned by the management of the organization, not HR per se, as the last bullet point suggests. It's HR's role to administer and facilitate, not necessarily the owner. It's really a top-down process, so bottom line is if your senior group within your organization don't really embrace it, I think you may be in trouble in terms of it being an effective process. Okay. So what's the future? So really performance, it says seen as a lagging indicator. I would argue, yeah, it is a lagging indicator. I mean, does everybody understand the difference between lagging indicators and what's the other word? Leading indicators, thank you. So leading indicators are things that identify, doing safety observations up front and taking proactive approach to it versus doing things and measuring it after it's already happened. So it clearly, performance management is more of a leading indicator. So accountability for past performance versus future development. So as a result of that, there was a movement. I would say it's kind of being, we've sort of moved away from that, but where some organizations have adopted the approach, and it was Kelly Services, Adobe did this, in response to the war on talent, they sort of moved away from the annual review sort of process and went to sort of the more informal ongoing check-ins, right? And the reason they did that was sort of three reasons. They looked at sort of developing their people versus dealing just with past performance, so in other words, more leading stuff. It was more agile, and it focused more on teamwork versus individual accountability. Okay, so that's sort of some of the things that have happened with performance management. Whoops. Some things that I think we should consider, though, and over the 30+ years I've been in the business. If we have trouble getting managers, supervisors that do have that performance conversation once per year, how difficult do you think it would be to have it done several times per year? Thoughts about that? Can you see that being a struggle? Absolutely. It needs to be prioritized. And, in our organization, for example, we say we should be doing it, we do an annual review, but we need to have a check-in as a minimum mid-year. My guess is Majority of people don't do that check-in. You know, they may review their objectives to say, okay, where am I with them? But is there really a good sit-down conversation between the manager and the employee? And I would say not that often. Yeah, and what we're talking about is really ongoing monitoring, right? Yeah, fair enough. And, you know, the second or the last question here is, what do you think about the future? And do you really think that it does bring value to the organization? Because if it doesn't, you don't think it brings value, then why would you do it, right? So thoughts about whether or not you believe this kind of process brings value to the organization. Anyone?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. So, you know, there's a couple of points here. One is, you know, we've often said, you know, a lot of times we look at talking to people about what they've done wrong, but we also need to catch them doing stuff right, you know, but we spend most of our time catching them do stuff wrong and deal with that piece. And I think the other message that, you know, in your comments are no surprises, right? So when we get to the evaluation, if they start hearing stuff they've never heard before, had no clue about, you're now in a lot of trouble, right? So, and in your case, obviously there was no surprise, right? So good. Well, boy, this thing's really touchy here, it looks like. So one of the things through, you know, again, and, you know, before I put the presentation together, I did a bit of research to see what was going on with companies now, because, you know, we had the whole movement of performance management and slight movement away from it, but multiple surveys confirm that most companies still conduct reviews in one form or another. Why? And again, you know, I think organizations need the process to allocate things like performance-based pay systems. I mean, we do that in our organization. Bonuses, promotions, and of course, development opportunities amongst individuals, right? Technology does make implementing best practices in terms of performance management, makes it far less practical using technology than the way it was in the paper era. Examples of that are, you know, the systems now out there, and there's a myriad of performance management systems, but they allow you to provide frequent feedback online, electronically. You're allowed to, you know, identify goals and then cascade them throughout the organization without having to, you know, reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Assessment of goal attainment, you know, simplify rating scales, do things like 360-degree feedback, which we'll talk about, and do things like rating calibration. So one of the basics in performance management is really to have somebody do their self-evaluation and then take that self-evaluation and create the, you know, the manager's evaluation of the individual. 360 is a little bit more time-consuming, a little bit more complicated, if you will, but certainly technology really does facilitate that whole process. And then finally, rating calibration, which we'll talk about at the end. I call it alignment because it's easier for me to understand, but basically it's really sitting in a room with the manager and the people that report to that manager, and then reviewing the people that report to those managers in a collective session and applying some of the definitions so that you get a more consistent approach. And we'll talk about that in a bit here. So important aspects, I think you need to have a well-defined written job description, okay, as part of the expectations. But like we said, a comprehensive orientation program. Performance review, or probationary review, excuse me, is an important aspect. Aligning with the organization's strategic directions and corporate values, culture and values. Again, if you say this is who we are and this is what we do, your performance management system needs to be aligned with that. Otherwise, you're kind of speaking out of both sides of your mouth, right? Align with the organization, we talked about that, should be collaborative. So again, it needs to be something that the manager and the employee work on together. It needs to be accurate and seen as fair. We'll talk about a little bit about how maybe to enhance that perception, if you will. Good performance, so it needs to recognize not only good performance, and as we talked about earlier, catching people doing things right, but also when performance is not quite up to standard, right? It should be ongoing, constructive, and positive, right? Feedback. In this process, we should identify developmental opportunities, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but it should include both measured results, sort of the what, okay, and the behaviors, the how you get it done. It needs to be linked to other programs. We've already talked about these programs. It needs to be, and I think to Chris's point, it needs to be easy to understand and use. Can't be too complicated. And it also needs to be specific to the role. So some of the things are going to be generic, but there also should be things that are specific to the role, because it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of process, right? And part of this is sort of training. I guess it's kind of what we're doing here today, but training the supervisors and managers to effectively use the performance management process. Okay. So here's the cycle. Pretty simple. We plan step one, so it's sort of an annual cycle. And part of the planning process is to document the plan, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. We monitor the process and the progress being made with those check-ins that we were talking about, and then the final review and evaluation. So in a little bit more depth, really what we're talking about here in step one is the start of the cycle. We identify and clarify and agree upon expectations. I think we made that point earlier. This is a great opportunity to say, if you have the right person for the right role and you clarify the expectations, hopefully 9 times out of 10 you're going to have success, right? So hopefully this sets you up for success, including 2 aspects. So objectives. So we're going to set objectives, or also known as goals, which tend to be measurable. And then we have competencies, which tend to be more behavioral based, or the how, if you will. Okay? And then we document the plan. Okay? Step 2 is really monitoring. So we monitor and evaluate the progress. We take corrective action where we need to, and through the process, ongoing, acknowledging good performance. And make changes as necessary. So sometimes, for example, you set an objective and the climate changes in the business that you're in or the service that you provide, and you have to review these objectives every once in a while to ensure that they're still pertinent, right? They're still applicable, all right? And the final step is really the end of the cycle, where you document the annual review and the evaluation, and you get a sign off, right? So let's dig a little bit deeper into this. So in terms of step 1 in the planning process, you're going to review the job description. Again, it's sort of one of the initial foundations, I think, of really setting clear expectations for any particular role. Review competencies. Sort of the how you're going to get things done, and then set measurable objectives, or the what. And sort of these are the things that are done collaboratively through what we call the SMART acronym in terms of setting goals. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a subsequent slide. And again, all of this helps us set very, very clear expectations. So here's, I just wanted to give you guys an example of what we're talking about when we're talking about competencies, and these apply more in terms of where I work, but certainly they could be applicable in your work environment, or you may have different ones. But for example, we have 3 here: leadership, planning and organizing, and problem solving, and with clearer definitions about what we mean by each of those competencies. And we're going to rate those competencies, and I'll show you our rating scale here in a moment in terms of how we would do that. And so we set not only competencies, but we're also going to set goals. And here's an example of a goal. Okay, so leading and completing, and again, this one's fairly specific, 2 safety toolbox discussions per month for a total of 24 per year. Quality to be measured by the employee feedback survey and evaluation of the manager. Okay, so before we rate a goal, again, what we want to look at, is it SMART? So I don't know, a lot of you may have seen this before, but for those of you that haven't, we're looking at a SMART goal being specific, i.e. it needs to specify clearly what needs to be done, all right? Measurable, so how much, how many, okay? Attainable, is it feasible and reasonable? Is it realistic? Can it be achieved given the employees' capabilities and resources? You've got to make sure that they've got the capabilities and resources, right? And then finally, is it timely? Is there a clear time frame? By when? Okay, so these are pretty clear things that I think you need to put in place to ensure that you have a good, measurable, attainable goal. Any thoughts or questions on this piece? We'll do an exercise on this later because I think it's important to at least start to play around with this, because often people have difficulty really getting specific about what their objectives are, right? So let me just go back to the one that I had put up on the board. Do people believe that this stated goal here meets the criteria that we've identified in terms of those SMART goals? Or can it be enhanced? Yeah, so we could tighten up the quality measure. Yeah. Good point, absolutely. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. So some of these things are, we can be fairly specific, but when we start talking about, we got the quantity, but sometimes it's hard to really nail down what the quality looks like, right? So. Yeah, well, you get your foot in the door by doing the 24, but how do we identify how good were they, right? And that's, yeah.
And do you wait till all the 24 are done and make it right?
Yeah, and I've often found that sometimes if you're having trouble putting quality information like this together, sometimes you go and talk to like finance people or people that are good with numbers, and they'll help you figure out a way to really nail this thing down, yep. Right? So, geez, this is touchy, this guy here. So, so on the monitor side, it's periodic feedback and performance as it relates to the competencies. We'll also check in on the objectives and change them if we need to. As we said, sometimes things change in the process. Conduct at least a mid-year review on both. And we've already talked about maybe doing more frequent check-ins than at least than a mid-year and a year-end. And continuous coaching, so ongoing, providing ongoing guidance, support, and direction, and ongoing feedback, both constructive and positive. So in terms of the final step, one of the things that we often do is ask for the incumbent employee to do a self-evaluation. I often find that self-evaluations are very telling, and more often than not, they're pretty darn, did I say that? Accurate, okay? Some people do inflate themselves, some people, but I would say more often than not, there are less people that inflate themselves than people that actually rate themselves lower than really where they are. So, so self-evaluations, I think, are very important as a first step. Prepare for the meeting with the employee, so collect your notes, and if you've got a good electronic system on a regular basis, you can go in and say, had discussion with so-and-so on such a date about this or whatever, so you can have that information available for you and prepare for that meeting with the individual. Back to the point we said a while back, and that there should be no surprises. All right, if you bring something up in a performance discussion, it should not be a surprise. If it is a surprise, then we do have a problem, right? We need to summarize accomplishments in that process, document the challenges or the gaps. So for example, if there's a gap in the performance, we need to say what that is, and then talk about how we're going to fix that gap. What are we going to do about that, right? And it's really, again, the second to last point, the first step towards an effective succession planning process, right? Because it's in this process that you're going to start identifying people that are meeting the expectations for their role, but those that are exceeding expectations, and they're those people that are probably those individuals that are going to be preparing themselves, and the organization should be preparing them to move on to bigger or larger roles within the organization. Okay. And then we have the sign-off, where employee receives a copy and it gets sent to file. Right? I want to keep this on record. So here's an example of a rating scale. You know, starting at the far left with significant improvement required, needs improvement, most performance expectations are met, but some weren't met or failed to be met. Solid contributor. So we've changed some of these definitions. You'll see I put simpler ones, I think, in the exercise or in the example, but we used to call it meeting expectations, and some people said, well, that doesn't sound very good. Well, meeting expectations is very good in terms of it means that on a day-in, day-out basis, you meet all the requirements and expectations of the role. So we kind of changed it to solid contributor because it sounded better, right? Significantly exceeds expectations, so meet and or exceed most of the established performance expectations, and then exceptional, which is some of my friends call the walk on water kind of. Yeah, I believe they do, because you have to. How do you compare it, right? And how do you tell somebody that they're meeting expectations? I don't know unless there's another alternative. I don't know what the alternative would be. Yeah, there's no right or wrong answer. I mean, what I gave you was my opinion, but I mean, Bev makes a good point, and so do you, right? Like I say, some companies have gone completely away from it, and they said, all we're going to do is focus on the future and developing our people, catching them do things right, and so, you know, there's a school of thought that says that that's a good process as well, right? Fair enough. We'll talk a little bit about that. I do have I'm not going to say a solution, but I have a methodology that helps to smooth that over a bit, okay? And I think your system does need to be, you know, if you're evaluating people as being exceptional or significantly exceeds, then the organization needs to recognize that, both in terms of just the recognition that they're doing that, but there has to be some probably monetary recognition as well, right? So, and if they're not doing that, then I think that is a problem. I would agree. So one of the things on the terms of, we're at the step 3 still talking about rating people, and you know, part of this is this, I wanted to talk a little bit about rater bias. So there are several, there's probably more than 5, but these are sort of this is the top 5, or the top of the hit list, if you will. So in terms of those biases that start to creep in when we evaluate people, right? So basically the halo effect. So when, you know, positive evaluations of one trait influences the way employees are rated in other areas, right, other traits. Employee is at work early every day and is rated exceptional in that area, but other parts of their performance are not exceptional, yet they're rated that way anyways because of their coming in early. Simple example, but those things do happen. Whoops, wow. Sorry, guys. So, horn effect, which is really the opposite of the halo piece. Negative evaluation of one trait influences evaluations of other traits. And these are just things I think we need to be careful with. So if one individual is late on several occasions, but overall does their job really well, they're rated down. Maybe on the attendance piece, they should be rated as not meeting expectations, but on the other parts of their job, they should be at least meeting expectations or above, depending on really what their performance is, right? Central tendency, so again, as the title suggests, applies ratings, you know, in the middle of the scale because it's a lot easier to do that, right? So just put everybody meet expectations or you're all solid performers. And while that might be true, I don't think it always is, right? Because you're, I think, doing a disservice to the individuals based on those that may be exceeding expectations and those that aren't meeting expectations, and there's gaps in their performance, and we're not addressing those gaps. Right? So strictness or leniency, so you know, consistently rating people either higher or lower, and being notoriously easy or tough. I've always heard that. Oh yeah, I'm just a tough evaluator. That's just the way I am. Well, okay, great, but you know why? You know, let's look at the detail. Yeah. So back to how do we make it fair and reasonable, right? And so part of this is, you know, if you've got objectives, as you've talked about in terms of, you know, it's very measurable, then you know math and you know science doesn't lie. You either, you know, the results are the results. But we still do have a part of this process is still very subjective, right? And so how do we make that fair? I'll talk about that here at the end of this discussion. So recency effect is another one, rating based on the recent events. So somebody had, you know, strong safety performance or whatever in the last little while, although the previous 8 months were not very good. So we're going to rate them as meeting and or exceeding expectations when we really should be rating them over the whole period of time that we're looking at. And usually it's that year. So overall, maybe it's not meeting expectations in this case, but we can say in the comments that, hey, look, yeah, the last couple of months, you've really stepped up your game, and if you continue to do this, you'll definitely will meet expectations next year, and these are the things that I expect from you, right? So we can turn things that are maybe can be perceived to be negative into a positive. Yes? So we should consider the 360 review. That it's a little bit more complicated, if you will, but it does give you more what I would call data points, right? Because we include the peers and subordinates of some of the raters, but or the ratee. But as a minimum, I would really suggest that you get a self-evaluation first, because then that gives you a good sense of where the person sees themselves. And it really kind of sets a good tone, I think, and benchmark for you to move forward. And the last thing I would say is that you should consider implementing an alignment or calibration process for particularly rating competencies, because competencies tend to be more subjective, and it's really, well, how I see the person, right? And people will say, well, that's how you see me, I don't agree, right? So so this is just a quick diagram to kind of explain the process. So you have the manager there, and you may not have a 3-level organization, but if you have a 3-level organization, at least you have the manager there who's what I would call the manager once removed, or the manager's manager, and he or she would be the chair of the meeting. HR is there to facilitate this process. And for example, this box here, the superintendent would review all his or her supervisors, okay, in the presence of their colleagues, and say, I see so-and-so to be a solid performer, and here's why, so they defend it, right? And you start applying these definitions that we looked at earlier in a group format, and what you get as a result, I believe, is a much more accurate application of those definitions, right? So if you say Joe is a solid performer, that becomes a benchmark solid performer, and you have Sam, who's maybe not meeting expectations, right? Depending on which competencies we're talking about. But you can use those data points, and you get input from other people who may know some of these people here, so some of his colleagues, right? Now this individual here is still accountable for managing and doing the evaluation of their people, but they're taking input and or more data points from others, even though it's still a subjective process. Plus the final say is really up to the manager who's in charge of it all, right? Because he's there or she's there to make sure we're being consistent and we're being fair. And that's one way of making a process like this a little bit perceived to be fairer, if you will. Yeah, you can do both.
Yeah.
You can do both, and you may not have that many levels. I get it. The idea, though, is that you always have one level above of the actual role, because if you have a dispute, guess who the arbitrator is, right? He or she's going to say, no, guys or gals, this, I know this person and I disagree with your evaluation, or I think this is the way it needs to be, because we need to be consistent and we need to be fair, right? So, but yeah, you may have to wear a couple of hats in a smaller organization. I appreciate that. How are we doing for time? I'm on time? Wow. Okay, close.
How would we rate his performance?
Did I meet expectations? Am I a solid performer? I don't know about that, but you guys don't have to answer that question. So, whoop, boy, I'll tell you, this thing is touchy, or is it just me? So, we do have an exercise, and I'll review that with you, but are there any other thoughts or comments before we move on to the exercise? I made this in big font, but I still need my glasses to read it here. So here's a case study, and we'll have you work at your tables. We may have this group here join this group over there, but anyways, we'll organize that in a moment. So you should have two documents in front of you. One is a 2-pager, and the other one is the actual performance review exercise. Those are the two things that I wanted to show you. So here's the case study. So John Smith's a 35-year-old supervisor, heavy equipment mechanic, of heavy equipment mechanics, who works for a contractor who performs service on a large heavy equipment for one of the major oil sand companies in the oil sands. Okay, he has been in the role for about a year and a half and is meeting expectations in most aspects of the role. There are areas for improvement and development. He is meeting expectations at problem solving and planning and organizing. The area where he needs to further develop is in his leadership skills. And by the way, this is a fictitious example, but from my experience, it has some relevance to reality, okay? He needs to delegate more, set clearer expectations, and hold his direct reports to account when performance is below standard, and also praise them when quality and quantity is met or exceeded. Okay, the problem has been that not all jobs he has been assigned have been completed on time and within budget. Working on attention to detail and follow-up skills could help him improve in these areas. John came from the hourly ranks and was an excellent technician, but needs to develop his leadership skills. He is seen as a rising star in the organization and has potential to move to the next level. Or in this organization, he's a supervisor. The next level would be superintendent over the next 2 to 3 years. His performance over the next few years and rate of development will determine if he is a candidate to move to a more senior role, such as area manager or site manager, okay? And so in your groups, I want to give you, I guess we're on schedule here, so I want to give you 20 minutes to complete the exercise, and then we'll give you 10 minutes to report out. Each group should elect a spokesperson. But of course, if that spokesperson or somebody else in the group wants to pipe up and provide some of their observations, they're more than willing to do so. Use the attached evaluation form. And so that's the attachment here. I've tried to simplify it for you. We've identified 3 competencies. Those are the 3 competencies that we looked at on the slide earlier. And we want you to evaluate those competencies using the scale. The scale is, again, a little bit simplified from the one that we had on the slide, but it's consistently exceeds expectations, consistently meets expectations, partially meets, and does not meet, okay? So there's really only 4, here, and we want you to rate each of these competencies, and then we also want you to identify areas for improvement And then what we'd like you to do is develop some SMART goals, okay? And on that note, what I'm suggesting here is we would like to do one that's more very specific, i.e. KPI related, and then one that's more sort of job specific related, okay? And I've given some examples here of what you could use, or you could use, you can make up your own, if you will, okay? So basically what we're doing here in this exercise is we're really doing steps 1 and 3, okay? We're doing the planning, okay, in terms of setting the goals, all right? Assuming, and then we're doing step 3, evaluating, but we're just evaluating the competencies because it's not really practical, I don't think, for us to evaluate the goals in this case. Okay. Is that clear in terms of what the exercise is about? Yeah? Okay. Did you two ladies here want to join this group here, or vice versa? And then we'll have 2 groups, I think. And then, so we'll give you 20 minutes to work on this. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and then we'll have you guys report out and see what you come up with, and see if there's any questions arising out of that. Good? Is that clear? We're going to report out here. So from this group over here, who's our spokesperson?
I'll be the spokesperson.
Okay, you have to use the mic. Apparently, sorry about that, but you can sit down, stand up, dance, do whatever you like.
So
Go ahead.
Start from the top?
Yeah. Start. Let's talk a little bit about the performance evaluation, and how did you rate the person?
Okay. So just under leadership, we rated them as partially meet expectation.
Okay.
The observations were to delegate more and meet with employees more often to do check-ins with how the employees are doing.
Right.
And then under planning and problem solving, we actually put as consistently meets expectation just based on the first paragraph. We decided to go with that.
Right, but you explained that you found an inconsistency, I think, right?
Inconsistency, only because
Yeah.
it said, in the first paragraph, it said that they're meeting expectations at problem solving and planning and organizing.
Right.
But then in the second paragraph, it says the problem has been that not all jobs
Right.
have been assigned.
Okay.
So we're assuming
Right.
that it's the employees who are responsible to get these jobs done are not performing.
Right.
So our biggest weakness would be the leadership of his employees.
Right.
So he needs to meet with them more often,
What
do
if
check-ins.
what if we would have changed the comment there? It says he's meeting. If I would have said he is meeting most expectations at problem solving and planning, you may have chosen to
Maybe partially.
rate that a
meets.
little bit differently,
Yes,
perhaps?
yes, yep.
Okay. Okay, fair enough.
Yep.
Sorry, go ahead.
So the areas of improvement we see, based on how we interpreted this.
Yes.
Was, one is delegation. And the other would be employee recognition / managing of employees. So the development plan would be meeting with employees more often to do check-ins on their job tasks.
Right.
And then delegating more of his tasks when he's meeting with these employees so that he knows what their strengths are.
Okay.
Under the SMART goals, the 2 things that we feel that would be beneficial for his overall performance would be leadership training.
Right.
So that would be actually completing training outside the organization to develop his leadership skills.
Okay.
And then the second would be a mentorship program so that he could grow as a leader. So find someone in the organization that's already a site manager that has been a supervisor in the past, where he could gain actual, previous experience from those people.
Yeah. So did you hear those two things? And I think it's important, like, development is one thing in terms of doing sort of this in-classroom stuff, but quite frankly, that should be about 10% of development, I believe.
Yeah.
even though I'm sitting here, did a presentation and whatnot. It's really more on the job, get on the ice and skate kind of stuff. And I think that was the second one that you talked about. And I think that's a really good, goal to have for somebody. And in terms of ongoing coaching as well.
Right.
Right?
So if he, his goal is to, let's say, meet quarterly with the employees or weekly, depending on what the need is, then from that mentor, he can actually gain insightful knowledge of how does he deliver the information, what does he talk about? Because if he's never done that before, it'll be challenging for him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so in the second goal, we talked about developing a mentor. How were you going to measure that in terms of quantity and quality? Did you give any thought to that? Because that's tough. It's tough to
Well,
sort
it would
that
be
out.
how many times he meets with the mentor, but the most important thing, the quality, would be talking with his mentor about, okay, hey, I met with these employees this week,
Right.
and then after he's met with the employees, he would meet with his mentor to say, hey, this is what happened.
Yeah,
This was the positive, this was the negative. What can I do now the next time?
Yeah.
So that I don't have, I learn on those negative aspects of those meetings.
And one way maybe of measuring the quality would have that mentor or someone else observe him, probably the mentor, in terms of those interactions he's having with his employees, right? To then sort of give him real-time feedback and to evaluate how he's doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Good. Good. Any other thoughts from the group here? Points that weren't that you'd like to cover? Okay. Good. Thank you. Group number 2. You pass over the baton there.
Let's sing. I'll lead y'all in song.
She automatically just gave it to you. Was that? Did you put your hand up, or was that just? Okay, go ahead.
So we found a lot almost identical to what you guys did. So that means we've all learned a lot of stuff. So on leadership, the observations that we had made was that he was unable to delegate efficiently or effectively. And maybe because he was unclear to his role, he'd been like a rock star, he'd been rising in the company and had done well hourly, but just didn't really understand what he needed to do as a supervisor. And then also as a leader, he was unable to get the jobs completed on time. So there was some breakdown in what was going on there. So we rated him as partially meets expectations. And then planning and organizing, we had some questions about that too, because if he was a great planner, wouldn't his jobs have been able to be completed on time, right? So that one was a little tough for us. So we took what was in the paragraph that you said he was good at it. So we gave him consistently meets expectations there.
So the same question, if we would have written that a little bit different, said he meets most expectations.
Yeah, we would have done it as partially.
Partially,
Because I kind of think they all go together, right?
Yeah.
And then
100%.
problem solving was kind of the same. We were like, well, we actually put him as partially meets expectations because if the jobs weren't being done on time as somebody in that role, that's kind of within your job to try to figure out why, because the goal is to meet expectations of budget and completion, right? So, and that maybe came from his lack of delegating, right? That people just weren't sure. So then the areas for improvement, we said leadership and problem solving. And some of the plans for leadership, same as you guys, some kind of developmental training as a leader, whether it's in-house, mentoring with somebody else, reviewing his own job description to understand what the expectation really is, providing ongoing support, monitoring, and then problem solving, same thing, with somebody else that had been in that role, what are the areas that you have to problem solve? We fictitiously said he was a welder. We just picked that.
Yeah.
And then said, as a welder coming in that was a rock star and could do 50 more jobs than his expectation was himself, maybe he couldn't equate that to then going, okay, how as a supervisor can I make everybody else do those 50 jobs? So just by having somebody maybe within the company that was a welder or somebody that was in a trade that was now in his role, how did they facilitate that?
Right.
So then our goals, the first one we said was completing a leadership program, either internal or external, whether it was online or something that, because we're assuming this company has all that. Completing the leadership program within 90 days with a pass. So then that was measurable, we figured that was doable, and then that was gonna then show up in his production, and that things would get better, right?
Okay.
And then performance management with his own employees by 90 days. So within 90 days that then he was able to show either digitally or paper that he had done performance reviews or done some
With
kind
his-
of
with his
interaction
employees.
with his employees,
Right.
which
Good.
would then show that he was getting better at leadership and problem solving.
Okay, good. You know, there's an old saying, and it is, you promote your best technician and often get your worst supervisor. Because we assume that those that are technically proficient are going to be our best leaders, and that's
Right.
not always the case, right?
And that's, we talked about that
Yeah.
he was a rising star in the company,
Yeah.
or rising star, but,
Yeah.
maybe he didn't, and that's why I said, some people are just foot soldiers, and they just want to be foot soldiers, and they're happy being foot soldiers.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, most often they make more money, and it's probably way less stress at the end of the day.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Not everybody is going to rise through the organization, and I don't want to preempt what Bev's going to talk about, but
Just
Yeah.
because he was
Exactly.
elder,
yeah, yeah.
if the organization just said, okay, you're gonna be the supervisor
Yeah.
now, and never gave him the skills.
The skills and the resources, the tools, yeah.
Because it is, and then when you're having to supervise your peers, so you're down here, and then all of a sudden now you're up over all of your welders who you've gone out for drinks with, or,
Yeah.
Gone to their baby showers or their
Yeah.
weddings, and now all of a sudden you're telling them that they didn't get their job done?
Yeah.
Like it's
it's a
hard.
different
It's hard
dynamic.
for people that have gone to school to do that.
Yeah.
That's just not natural.
Yeah,
You learn that from either training or from other.
Yeah.
right.
And you hear the different theories about, is leadership just natural? Like, some people are just good natural leaders. Yeah, that's true. But I think it is also a skill that can be learned and developed over time, right? Because not all of us are just natural at different things, right? And you'll see some people that were, not necessarily good at something, but, practiced and became good at it. So all good comments. Yeah. Good. Good. Is that helpful to give you a kind of a sense of what we're talking about? We thought maybe an exercise would give us, again, it's like anything else. It's nice to talk about it in theory, but if you, using my hockey analogy, you got to get out in the ice and skate around a little bit, and maybe make some mistakes or whatever. But eventually, that's how you perfect your game, right? So, well, thanks so much for your participation. That's I think the exercise was put things hopefully into perspective for everyone. Thanks so much, and I'll pass, I guess, things over to Chris or to Bev.